Okay, so for the next 15 minutes, we're going to talk about design for ethics, and I'm going to share, I guess, the stories that I've done over the last 2 years. We were running experiments, proof of concepts, particularly around generative AI, and I guess the lessons learned and what I feel, why I am excited about the opportunity for it, particularly for the role of human-centered designers in it, all right? So everyone to talk about ethics because it's like, I believe that nothing says I'm fun at parties like talking about the moral implications of computer software. So we're moving on to the first one. Ethan Mollick, who's a professor of innovation in the US, he released a book called Co-Intelligence. And he talks about, he says, I believe in getting to know AI, really getting to know AI involves 3 sleepless nights. And he talks about his first experience that he had with AI. And I'm sure we're all the same here when we first use a diffusion model, a large language model. I remember, typing into ChatGPT and ask for it, to write some poetry for me. And then you start mucking around and writing songs, and then you start turning around and going, oh, wait a sec, can it do work? Can it synthesize? Can it review a transcript? Can it help me create a workshop? And you suddenly come to this thing, you're realizing this is new technology. I haven't experienced something like this before. And you get to the point going, the world has changed. And it's just, the world has changed, what's happening, but also just looking around and going, that sense, your role and your ability and your skills, and what does it mean for that? And that's where that sleeplessness comes from. And I think that if we can actually apply an ethical framework to these projects and what we're doing, we put in these guardrails, we can actually start to claw back some of that sleep and we can rest better. So at its core, ethical AI is about considering the impacts of the use of AI systems on real people. Now, a lot of people think ethics is just a philosophical concept, but it's actually like this practical tool that we use all the time in our day-to-day activities. And the thing I like about ethical frameworks, particularly in technology, it actually allows us to steer individuals and organisations to create and shape these innovations, which will be beneficial for humanity rather than being harmful and discriminatory. The other thing about looking at ethics is that they provide this structure for decision making. So often when you have this sort of fuzziness in front of you and the choice isn't quite easy, it actually creates this framework where you can actually, as a team or the organisation, can go through and say, what is the right way? So I look at ethics to be something like a steering wheel, helping us navigate these tricky situations rather than like a blocker or something against it. There's a gentleman called Paul Ferrilio, who is a French cultural theorist, and he writes on the impact of technology onto culture. And he said this wonderful thing. He said the invention of the ship was the invention of the shipwreck. He talks about how when we create these new technologies, we create these things, we actually create the accident at the same time. We create planes and plane crashes, cars and car crashes. And so when you talk about this, I believe that ethics is one way to help us avoid it. Now, lots of things can go wrong with AI. I guess the 3 big challenges, the 3 accidents that people seem most concerned about are around bias, they're around privacy, and their explainability. Bias, the challenge with bias is it unfortunately impacts discriminated groups, minorities and things like that. And we can do it at scale and speed, which is unprecedented. So there's lots of use cases around that. We look at privacy. You only have to go and do a search for Facebook and see how they just again and again destroy privacy. They just steal information, our data and information from us without our permission. And the last thing is looking at that area of explainability, the challenges you come into it. Now, I don't know if there's any technical people here and they understand large language models and how they particularly work, but if I'm getting ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini to review an email, do I really need to know how this sort of pattern recognition software is actually improving my written word? I don't. But if I'm a doctor and I'm using AI for a medical recommendation to diagnose something, I 100% have to know how it's done. What have you done? And that's where that sort of explainability comes in, that sort of understanding. So helping to understand what is the context you're working in, what's important, that's what the ethics framework will help us with. Okay, the next one is that, so moving forward, my first thing was saying how do I actually start to engage with people rather than brushing me off going, you're a human-centered designer, you're a UX designer, what do you know about this? Leave it to the grown-ups. And so one of the ways I found and this was taken from Reed Blackman, who wrote a book called Ethical Machines, and he outlines these steps that you can follow. And the first one, he says, state your values by thinking about your ethical nightmares. Now, your ethical nightmares will change according to your industry. But when I would go to a data scientist and go, hey, what's your ethical nightmare? What are you worried about? I would talk to a stakeholder, an executive. They would talk about brand reputation, bias, things like that. So you understand what that is. So it could be a case of like in healthcare, I've spent a lot of time in health. One of the big things they worried about is things like, particularly if you're going to use it in that diagnostic situation, you're worried about false positives and false negatives. Telling someone, yep, you're fine, you haven't got it, and they have, or yes, you've got it, and they don't. So this idea of like, if you're worried about those diagnostic and false negatives and false positives, then something like do no harm would be your value. The next step you need to do is actually to say, well, how do we link what our ethical values, the organisation's larger mission and purpose they're trying to work through? And this is critical. If you do not weave your what you allow ethically, if you don't put your ethical values throughout the whole of the AI project, if you do not put it within the organisation, people will feel free to ignore it. It's a nice to have, it's not a need to have. You need to draw that direct line saying, okay, how do we do it? So for instance, it could be a case of if you're looking at things like, going back to the healthcare example, an organisation might say, like, we're first and foremost a healthcare organisation that's looking after the most important thing in the world, people's life and well-being. And then you could say, people entrust us to deliver high quality care, they entrust us with their lives. As we grow and we go forward, we'll do nothing to diminish that. So we want to make sure that there is no change to that care. And that would be that's a good way to sort of tie into what you're talking about there. The next thing you need to do is then start to put in the guardrails. So look at what your ethic values are, but what is permissible? How do you actually start to put shape and explain with it? So again, if we go back to the healthcare example, you could then turn around and say, we will make sure that our AI systems consistently outperform our best doctors. So if we can't beat the best, the 1% of doctors, if we're not better than them, we're not shipping it. That's a really strong, clean thing people know. You could talk about privacy, and this one I find it really interesting because it's something that a lot of people don't necessarily, they blanket say, yeah, we should have privacy, but what does it mean for the organisation and how do we let people know this is what we're going to work with? So for instance, you could turn around and say privacy, we will never sell your data to a third party. That'd be nice. Or they might say, we will share your data, but we'll make sure it's anonymised and be aggregated. And you say, okay. Or the last one could be like, actually, we'll just let people see what data we have about them. All three are permissible. It depends on, you just have to say what's on the table and what's off the table, and people start to understand, okay, this is the way we work. And the last thing you look at doing is saying, Joe, how can you articulate that you will realise your ethical goals without realising this sort of the ethical nightmare? So what can you do to avoid it? And the last one just simply comes in to talk about the why, the what, the how. You're going to talk about why we're doing this, how, who's accountable, what we'll do around training. You do things. So at a high level, you're starting to explain this is what we're doing with it. And then what you actually realise, what you've actually started to do is you actually created something like an ethical North Star. We have product North Stars, we have organisational North Stars. Why not have an ethical North Star that people can see where we're heading and this is what we're doing? It also becomes a very good thing. You can put in communication, you can share it with the users and things like that, and it becomes really important for them, not just the employees, to say, yes, we take it seriously and we're doing that. The next thing that's really important, if you've got your ethical North Star, we chatted earlier this morning, we were talking about the seat at the table. This is about creating your own table. So most organisations will already have some sort of governance or structure or something like that in place. There'll be someone who's doing it. So I would say go out and find those allies in this particular space who can have a conversation with. It can be from cybersecurity, it can be from data, it can be legal, it can be governance. I would say the first person you need to grab, if you're going to start on this journey, grab a lawyer. It's really complicated. It gets complicated very quickly. You need to bring them in. And you bring that. And then if you're a human-centered design, you can pull up the table and say, okay, can I talk to this? I'm going to represent human-centered designer. Let's talk about AI ethics. and start bringing that. And that's where you can start to do, whether it's a working group or a committee, it actually starts working through and saying, let's shape it and let's like move through it. May not be aware, but in 2019, Australia released its AI ethic principles. Just Google it. It is a really nice piece of work. They also released in August this year the AI safety guidelines as well. That's another one to check out. But you'll just see here the human-centered designs. I hope you're all smiling. The first two, human societal well-being. So you're making sure that we're not damaging the world, the planet, things like that. Those nice big meaty questions we're going to answer. Second one, human-centered values. How do we make sure we're not being discriminatory? How do we make sure we're being accessible? So that's what they're starting to bring in. And that's where you can actually start to bring in your sort of, I guess, design superpowers with it. As you move through all the others, there is a place to go through the other one. You can look at contestability, just mapping out when can people respond to a system, when can they sort of say, hey, listen, I'm not happy with this, and do that. So you can actually be a critical part in helping all these many different parts move together and say, okay, what's the response with that? What's the mitigation? One of the processes I've done is when I was taking an experiment or a proof of concept and then sort of trying to say, okay, can we take this to product? How do we move this to the next thing? Used to always find people who would have doubts, or people just start asking questions. And what I would try and uncover with them is what I would call a critical question. A bit like, what's your ethical nightmare? What is that thing you're really, really worried about? And then you take that, and it could be something like bias, it could be around discrimination, it could be around transparency. And you take that question and I'd say, okay, here's the principle that it works with. And then from the principle, you give them the context and explain a little bit. You can give them, here's an example of Facebook, Twitter, Apple, Amazon, whoever you want to do, doing a bad example of it. And you scare them a little bit. And then you would then turn around and say, let's then do an activity. And this is another thing where your UX superpowers can come into. You can run these workshops and run these activities. It could be a mapping exercise. We can use canvases, I'll show you in a second. There's lots of things that you can do and say, let's work through this as a group and work out what should the mitigation need to be like? What does that need to work with? And the last thing, tips. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there. We're still struggling to understand what is best practice, but there are things you can say, hey, listen, here's the things you can do. Just simply around transparency and explainability. Transparency, just making sure people can understand it's in English. Take that complicated form and explanation and say, this is what we're doing. Couple more tools. I mentioned Canvas before. There's an ethics canvas. You should check this out. It's a really nice thing to do. It's really good at a product team level. You can sit there and say, just let's have a discussion with it. Even if you're not bringing in AI, you're using data, and that data is going to be used, so it's worthwhile having that conversation. So it's a really worthwhile tool to have with that, and I've used with that. The other thing was really interesting. I think this year they released the Human Rights Impact Assessment Tool. This collaboration between NAB and the Australian Human Rights Commission. And what I liked about this, it's not another risk framework. What they came up with was 43 questions, specifically banks, to ask in their process. And it's like asking data, like, are there underrepresented groups here that we should be aware of? Is there data missing from this? So, and their idea behind it is that these are the questions that you put in your existing governance or risk or AI process, whatever it is. And I like that idea where you're not trying to complicate it. Designers were famous for making everything worse. This makes it easier because you say, where's your process? Here are the key questions, and the appropriate people need to be able to have a response. And we can document and move through it. And I thought it was a really nice thing. There's questions in there that I actually use in my practice and discussion and say, like, okay, it's just a really nice way to form it. Moving to the next one, I guess the other thing is I've got a flywheel here, and I was reading a journal of marketing a few months ago. I said I was fun and parties. I really am. I read lots of interesting things. And they had this paper that talked about looking, products that slapped AI in it and said, are consumers more or less likely to buy it? What does it do to what you're doing as a value proposition? And they turned around and said, it actually performs worse. People are less likely to buy it. And one of the reasons they did it, well, one is like, why do I need it? How does it make my life better? But they also talked about this idea of trust. And there's not trust in AI. People aren't quite sure. When they're unsure of something, they don't have trust. And if you break down trust, there's two kinds of trust. There's the cognitive trust. That's the one when you, that left brain, you read through the information, you get the data, yep, I've spent with it. And there's the right side, which is the emotional trust. Emotional trust is where you turn around and you just have the emotional trust, like, I trust that. It looks like me, it feels, it looks familiar. It is that sort of like hard to pin it down. And in this paper spoke about how they did the testing, and they found that when you built that emotional trust, and you can build it through transparency, explainability, things like that, you increase that, you had a higher purchase intention. And then from the highest purchase intention, you then got business growth. And then after that, you got further investment in AI, and then ethical practices go through. And I like this because I guess what we need to remember, while we can turn around and say, this is the right thing to do, we should absolutely do it. We still need to root it in a way that businesses understand and it makes sense to them. So if the business uses flywheels, we can do this. If we're talking about sustainability and growth, let's do that. If we're talking about differentiation, doing that. But that's the critical part with this. Change the language and present it in a way that business go, okay, I can see how this is not an impediment to innovation. This is not increasing the complexity of our governance or risk process. This is going to help us grow. This is going to help us be sustainable. It's going to help us with brand reputation. It's going to help us with legal risk, whatever it is. So it's a nice way of going through it. I just thought in a couple more slides, end this. The first thing you need to do if you're going to go into AI ethics, you need to know something about AI and you need to know something about ethics. So I would say there's so many courses available, AI foundations, you can do it. If you're working in an organization that's AWS or Microsoft or Google, they've got some really good sort of foundational courses to do, or you can go to somewhere like Academy XI. Next thing is how do you start educating yourself about these ethical principles? You don't need to go and read the great philosophers, although you can if you want to, but it'll hurt your head and you'll get more confused and more depressed. So I would say just look at the ethical principles, start reading through that. There's lots of nice supporting information. They've done a really good job there. Look at the ethics canvas as well. That's a nice way to sort of start your way through it. Find your ethical AI allies. I like to call them the nerdy Avengers. Who's this team that's going to come and protect the organisation and the company from the sort of the big bad world out there, the bias, the privacy, the unexplainability that's sort of lurking in the deep. So you can go through, find that group and then work together. This is not a solo thing and this is really complicated. And as I said before, make sure there's a lawyer on the team because you will quickly get into things around human rights and you need someone to say, yep, it applies or it doesn't apply. Look at a business case value. Like how do you actually turn around and say, well, how to make this in a way that's meaningful for the executive, the stakeholders and the teams moving forward? What's that thing they're going to be worried about? How am I going to get their attention? And the last thing, and this is where I start with a lot of things when I'm trying to, I guess, motivate, shift people to it. I use the three-part process: scare them, inspire them, and start small. You know, you can talk about scary stories, but also talk about that North. That's what I like to talk about, ethical North Stars, where you talk about that vision or what they're trying to do. Let them know what the world can be, paint that picture, use your storytelling abilities. And then the last thing, what's that smallest thing that you can do? Is it the ethics canvas? Is it starting a small committee? Is it actually a conversation about, you know, what's your ethical nightmare? And then you're just collecting those and then sort of just using that as data with it. I'll just leave this. If you're interested, I'm happy to chat and share if you're having a struggle, because I know this is very hard if you're interested. Happy to chat on LinkedIn and share what I've learned. I've found this journey very lumpy. It hasn't taken me where I expected to, finding at the moment. It tends to be taken by, now responsible AI is becoming such a big thing. It tends to be a technical thing and it's driven by cybersecurity. It's driven by data and this whole ethical framework. They're not necessarily interested in it. So there are challenges with that, but it's no different to any other challenges you have in the digital space that you've worked through before. It's just being mindful with that and patient and going through that. So I'm happy to share all the things that I got wrong and a few that I got right. Thank you.